the white privileged hipsters and social justice warriors living in capitalist Silicon Valley don't like it when I criticize their beloved communism and socialism. Well, mainly socialism, because they seem to think that socialism and communism would be two different things, and that socialism would somehow be better, because they have no idea and never really experienced either of that. They think that both, if they believe in communism, they think that it's like this great utopia. But if they're socialists, they think the same thing about socialism. They think, oh, it's like this great utopia. It's like, oh, give an example for a socialist country, and they go like, oh, Sweden, because Sweden would be an example for a socialist country. They think they figured it out, right? They think that they know what true socialism looks like, right? And so they think that true socialism, no, that wasn't the Soviet Union. That was false socialism. True socialism, that you have in a capitalist country like Sweden. Yes, of course. And that's why you geniuses live in a capitalist country, right? If you think capitalism is so evil, why don't you go to a socialist country, right? And it's not Sweden. Don't go to Sweden, because that's not a socialist country. That's just as capitalist as you are, because you are engaged in capitalism. So if you hate capitalism so much, well, why don't you go to an actual socialist country, right? See how that works out, right? But anyway, I digress. So anyway, these people don't like it if I criticize their beloved socialism. So don't worry, I'm not gonna do that this time. That was as much criticism as you're gonna hear in this video. So I, gotten the criticism out of the way, and the rest of the video is just gonna be about explaining the symbolism, because I noticed something about the symbolism, and this is, of course, what you see here. This is the most typical communist and socialist symbolism right here. Those are the most typical symbols. There are a few others that, but the other ones are a bit outdated. I'm going to talk about the outdated symbols as well. I'm going to talk about all the iconic symbolism associated with socialism and communism. Because I noticed something interesting about all of them, something that connects all these symbols, and these are historical symbols. This is basically, this was actually before socialism and communism. This is like proto-socialism, right? Those are the Jacobins, and of course, not quite as old. This is, of course, very iconic, from the Russian Revolution, because at the beginning, as symbols, or it was mainly the hats, right? So the first symbols you had were actually the hats, and you have that iconic Jacobin hat, and of course you have a lot of other symbolism here as well. This is also very typical symbolism that has a lot of meaning that I could go into. You probably know a lot of these symbols as well, but the most iconic, of course, when it comes to the Jacobins, is the famous Jacobin hat. That nowadays a lot of people, they just call it Smurf hat, because it looks like a Smurf hat. And of course, this then gave rise to the most ridiculous theory of all, namely that the Smurfs would actually be communist. Again, that's or socialists, whatever you like, right? And that's like how a lot of communists and socialists see socialism and communism. They see it as like this utopia, but of course this is what it would really look like. Just kidding. You probably know that's the infamous UNICEF advertisement using the Smurfs. But let's be honest, that's what it would look like, That I mean, this the Smurf village is kind of what they promise you, and what you just saw, that's what it would actually look like. Just kidding. Anyway, so no, of course, the Jacobin hat doesn't have anything to do with the Smurfs, obviously. If anything, of course, yes, the Smurfs hat was modeled after the Jacobin hat. But I, don't interpret too much into that. That doesn't have to mean that the Smurfs are communists. They're not. Anyway, I digress. So what does that actually mean? So if it doesn't have anything to do with the Smurfs, then what's the point of that stupid hat? And these early communist hats, they look stupid, right? This one as well. It looks stupid. But what's the point? Why is it shaped like that? And of course you have the other symbols, and of course the most prominent symbols, and you have that on the cap as well. The red star. You have it here. This is of course the most iconic. Version, with the most iconic communist symbols. You have the red star, red, like on top, this red 5-pointed star, very iconic. And then, of course, hammer and sickle. And in this case, you also have, you have it framed by whatever this is. I don't even know what you call that in English. But we'll get to that symbol as well. Actually, that symbolism has some meaning as well. They all have meaning, and they all have the same meaning. It took me a while to figure it out, right? And you say, well, of course they have the same meaning. They all symbolize communism. Yes, yeah, sure. But why would communists, take these symbols in the first place? I mean, what does that even have to do with anything? Why a red star? What does that in itself have to do with communism? If I was a communist and I was trying to come up with a symbol, why would I choose these symbols? It doesn't make any sense. Out of the top of my head, I could come up with better symbols. I would like maybe use an equal sign or something. To symbolize that everyone is equal, and maybe a crossed out dollar sign to symbolize the opposition to capitalism. And I think these would be better, communist symbols if it's purely about communist symbolism. But what exactly is the symbolism of those things? They have, but what does that have to do with, with a workers' revolution or with equality, or they don't symbolize that at all. Of course you could argue, and that's how communists explain. I mean, I haven't really heard an explanation for the red star. I think most communists don't even have an explanation for that. But, the hammer and sickle, they usually explain as, well, these are the tools of the workers. The hammer represents the tool of the worker, and the sickle represents, a tool of a farmer. And that's how they usually explain it. But even if it's that's what it's supposed to be, I could come up with better symbols than that, right? I mean, even in the 19th century, that's not actually the tools an actual farmer would use, or an actual worker. They didn't, even in the 19th century, they didn't actually use hammers like that when like building a building. They had more modern tools, and same with the sickle. Even in the 19th century, a farmer wouldn't use a hand sickle like that to harvest a field. That would take forever. They had more modern tools than that, even in the 19th century. So why use these outdated tools? If it's about tools, why not use modern tools? I mean, obviously you want to portray communism as something new, as something modern, as something revolutionary. So of course they would use modern tools. I mean, of course, in reality, they probably did use ancient tools like that. But in their propaganda, you'd want to portray them as modern. So why use these ancient tools that in reality, no one would really use, right? Except in socialist countries. Yeah, but so yeah, what's the point? I mean, there isn't really a good explanation for it, and the only explanation is like after the fact, after they like already decided on those symbols, and then afterwards they try to explain why they used this. But even the first time I saw it or thought about these symbols, I was like, there has to be a deeper symbolism about this, and there is. and I found it, and I'm so surprised that no one else has made that connection. Apparently, I haven't found those symbols explained anywhere. So so for the first time, I'm gonna try and explain these symbols, what I think they represent. And it makes sense, and you can connect all these symbols. They all have the same symbolism. And of course, in reality, hate to burst your bubble, but it doesn't actually have anything to do with communism or socialism. I mean, obviously it has now, but originally, these are all occult symbols. All of them. They are as occult and as pagan and as ancient as you can get. And actually, that occult symbolism is very obvious, even blatant. But like I said, I don't think anyone, at least on the internet, has made an explanation about this, or has even made that connection, even though it's super obvious. But, I think it throws a lot of people off, right? Because a lot of people don't make that connection. They wouldn't think of even the possibilities that the symbols that the communists use could be ancient occult symbols, because especially when communism first came along, it didn't present itself as like an ancient paganism or something. Quite the opposite. It of course presented itself as something modern, and most socialists and communists are of course atheists, so they are very much opposed to any religious beliefs, even pagan religious beliefs, right? So a lot of people don't think of making that connection because they wouldn't connect communism or socialism with ancient mysticism in the first place. But these are ancient, mystic, occult, pagan symbols, and I'll explain to you why. So, who do you think of when you think of a hammer? You think of Thor, right? I don't know, how do you pronounce that in English? Because, I, as a German, I obviously have a problem with TH. So do you pronounce it Thor, or do you pronounce it Thor? In German, you would probably pronounce it Thor, but actually the German name is Donna, or Donna, which is the same word as the German for thunder, which makes sense, because that's the same in English. It's the same word as the word for thunder, as you can see, because he has that hammer, and he strikes lightning from his hammer. So that's whom you think of, right? When you think of a hammer, you think of Thor. I'm just gonna call him Thor, Donna. Okay, and who do you think of? As you can see, I just searched hammer and Didi, right? So who do you think of when you think of a sickle? We do the same thing. Sickle and Didi. Let's see what we get. Oh, look. What is that? I didn't even know that. Oh, look. Here we actually have... That's not even... Oh, that's Seth. Oh, bingo. That's not even the... Well, that's actually not even the god that I was thinking of. Because I was, as you can see, I was more like thinking along the lines of, ancient Greek and Germanic and Roman mythology, right? But right, you have that same thing in Egyptian mythology as well. And actually, if you look at that, of course, I know that what he's holding here, that's not a hammer, but the way he's holding it, and together with the sickle, that actually in itself already looks a lot like the hammer and sickle of the communists, doesn't it? right? But I wasn't even aware of that, and that wasn't even the deity I was looking for. But yes, you have this. Of course, you have the same thing in Egyptian mythology as well. You actually have these kinds of symbols in all, and that was actually what I was going for. You have these kinds of symbols in all ancient pagan religion. You have it in Germanic religion, obviously with Thor, Donner. You have it in Roman and Greek mythology, and that was actually what I was looking for. But instead, I found it in Egyptian mythology, where you have it as well. You have it in all ancient religions or ancient pagan religions. You have it in all, and that was what I was getting at, right? So, yeah, but actually, I was actually Seth fits as well, and maybe I'll do some follow-up videos and explain the mythology behind it in more detail. But I wasn't actually looking for Seth, so because when I think of a deity with a sickle, I don't think of Seth. I think of let's just search for deity and Saturn, because that's who I think of. I think of Saturn, of obviously not the planet Saturn, the deity Saturn, because as you can see, I think that's the most famous example. But of course, you have Seth as well. You have a lot of deities like that. You have a lot of deities in ancient mythology in all countries with a hammer, and if they don't have a hammer, they have a sickle, right? And of course, this isn't actually, it says Saturn, but this isn't actually Saturn. That's the other guy, Kronos. That's actually Kronos, not Saturn. But Kronos is the Greek equivalent to Saturn, so it's the same deity anyway. And of course, Seth again would be the Egyptian equivalent. So that's why they all have the same symbol. That's why they all have a sickle, and that's and also the mythology behind them is also the same, because actually they are all the same deity, just different equivalents of the same deity in different cultures. So this is Kronos, and Kronos of course also has a sickle. But when I think of a sickle, in mythology, I think of Saturn with his sickle. So I searched for Saturn with a sickle, but instead I get Kronos. I mean, I can understand why, because it's the same deity, but I would still like to have a picture of Saturn. Well, it's the same as with Kronos, because Kronos is known for eating his child. There's also some symbolism behind that, but it's the same. Saturn looks the same. Here's a nicer picture. Actually, in this case, the sickle itself kind of looks like a hammer, doesn't it? But anyway, typically Saturn is portrayed with. Here you have it. Here you have the most typical. Here, this is the most typical depiction of Saturn. Right, and here you have that grain that you have on the communist. Here's you have an explanation for that as well, because he carries the grain as well, right? So you have an explanation for the grain here on the side, and actually the way the grain is shaped is also symbolical. But maybe we're getting too much into occult symbolism, because there's a lot of meaning behind this, and it would be a lot to explain if I explain it all. But anyway, as you can see, Saturn is holding the exact same kind of sickle that the communists use. And actually Thor, the one with the hammer, he also represents Saturn. Seth represents Saturn. All these ancient deities with a hammer or a sickle represent Saturn. Because, going back to Thor, to Donner, what was his image? The hammer, and with the lightning striking from it. And that's also imagery for Saturn. All of this is imagery for Saturn. The sickle, again, is imagery for Saturn. I mean, obviously the deity Saturn, but actually the planet Saturn as well. And then then it gets a bit into plasma cosmology, which explains all these symbols, and that all these symbols have actually a physical equivalent with the planet. That's why you have that association with the planets as well. Ancient pagan religions made no distinction between the planets and their deities. To them, the planets were their deities, That's why, usually when we think of ancient pagan religion, we think of sun worship. And that's true, they did worship, the objects in the sky, but not just the sun, but the planets, of course, as well. And a lot of them were actually worshipping Saturn. That's why you have these Saturn deities in all the ancient pagan religions. So to them, the planets and the deities were the same. The planets represented the deities. And so the symbols the deities are carrying are symbols for the planets as well. The sickle is a symbol for Saturn, because that's kind of how it looked back then. How the moon can look like a sickle, right? When it's not full. That's the way Saturn looked back then. It could also look like a sickle. You have to, get into plasma cosmology, and that explains how these planets would have looked back then, and how these symbols are related to the planets, and how that came about. And then you also have the explanation for Thor's hammer, with the lightning striking from it, which is again, the same as the symbol for Saturn here. So why is lightning striking from his hammer? Because again, Thor is a symbol for Saturn, and Saturn back then, and then I'm not going to get too much into that. You have to, read up on that yourself. Just read up on plasma cosmology, because there's this theory that planets also sort of carry electricity. So back then it would appear as though there was, to the people that back then, it appeared as though there was lightning striking from Saturn. That's why you have Thor's hammer with the lightning striking from it, which was also a symbol for Saturn. And of course, the hammer itself is also symbolic for something that people saw in the sky back then. But to go into the details as to why that is and why they saw these kinds of planetary formations and phenomenon that they saw and that they then associated with the deities, for that you have to get into plasma cosmology. I'm not going to do that here because then it would get too long. And I'm not going to go too much into ancient mythology either. I'm just, giving you the general idea so that you see that there is a connection. And I'm absolutely sure that or maybe you ask, well, how can you be so sure that, the association really is with Thor and really is with Saturn? Couldn't it also be other deities? Why does it have to be Saturn? Weren't there also other deities that used a hammer or a sickle? And there were, of course, like Seth, but again, Seth also represents Saturn. Actually, most deities in ancient times that had symbols like that, they actually all represented Saturn. So yeah, and Kronos, of course, he also represented Saturn. Same thing. So but okay, so then how do I know that it represents Saturn at all? I mean, a hammer doesn't necessarily have to represent Saturn, and a sickle doesn't necessarily have to represent Saturn. Of course, both of these symbols together, both of these symbols are symbols for Saturn. So, it would be quite a coincidence if since you have both of the symbols together, and both of them are for Saturn, then would be quite a coincidence if they weren't symbolizing Saturn. But of course, it would still be a possibility. Maybe it is a coincidence. Except, of course, it isn't. I'm 100% sure it represents Saturn. Why am I so sure? I'll show you. You see me Google it myself, okay? Go it myself. So we just search for Saturn and symbol. And now I show you the symbol for Saturn. Oh, I mistyped it. But anyway, this is the symbol for Saturn. You can see it, right? This is the symbol for Saturn. What happened? I searched for Saturn. Let's do it again. Saturn symbol. So, you see it, right? This is the symbol for Saturn. You can probably, well, these are both the symbol. Well, yeah, you can see it, right? These are basically the same symbol. This is the symbol for Saturn. This is the communist symbol, hammer and sickle. This is the symbol for Saturn, hammer and sickle. This is the sickle. This is the hammer. The hammer is a bit, as you can see, it's a different style of hammer. Oh no, actually it's the same style of hammer because, oh, actually this hammer is two-sided as well. So in both cases, it's actually a two-sided hammer. So yeah, you have the two-sided hammer and you have the sickle, and that's the symbol for Saturn. Here, see that? Symbol for Saturn. Hammer and sickle. That's the symbol for Saturn. And as you could see in that image of Saturn the deity, he also carries the grain. So now we're left with the stars. And, if the grain, the hammer, and the sickle are all symbols for Saturn, well, how does the star fit into that? Well, the star is, of course, the morning star. Now you think, well, Saturn isn't the morning star. Well, yeah, Saturn isn't the morning star now. But back then, the morning star did actually refer to Saturn. I'm not going to Google that now. You can Google that yourself. And that's true. The original morning star was Saturn. So again, the five-pointed star is again a symbol for Saturn. So all of the imagery here, these are all symbols for Saturn. Okay, so then what about the caps? The hats. This stupid hat. Surely this hat looks so stupid it couldn't have any symbolism, right? And with the checkerbands, this stupid hat, what kind of symbolism could that have? Except that there's moves, right? Well, no, it does have a bit deeper, symbolism than the smooths. So this is Attis. As you can see, he looks like a smooth. And that's what originally the Chacobans hats represented. That's why they choose that, That's why they choose that as their symbol. Not because they were into smurfs, but because they were, again, into ancient mythology, and in this case, into Attis. Who is Attis? It's actually, all of these are the same god, just the same god in different cultures. And that will become apparent once you talk about them. I don't know if I should do that because we're getting too much into ancient mythology. You know what? I think I'm going to make that a two-part video. So here I'm just going to focus on the communist symbols and where they come from. And if I'm going to explain the occult meaning behind it, I'm going to do that in a separate video because otherwise it would get too long. So this time, for now, just know that, this symbol, again, represents an ancient pagan deity, Attis, which again is a deity akin to Saturn. Of course, Attis isn't Saturn, but every culture had their version of Saturn, and again, Attis is actually another version of Saturn, just in a different culture. And once you read up on the mythology behind Attis, that will become apparent. And I'm probably going to do that in a future video, explain it in more detail, and explain that these are all deities that represent Saturn, and that all these deities have the same mythology. So, but, for now, just know that it's also an ancient pagan deity that's behind it. So now we're only left with one symbol, and that's the another stupid looking hat. So what does that represent? Well, we're talking about ancient pagan deities representing Saturn. Well, and we already had said, right? We searched for a sickle, and actually I was hoping to get Saturn, but instead of getting Saturn, we got Seth as a result, which is, of course, the Egyptian equivalent. And Seth even had both. He had a hammer and a sickle. But of course, Seth is all of these. These deities are not alone. These deities interact with other deities, other planetary deities in the sky. So, of course, when you think of Seth, you also think of Osiris, because, they usually go together. But, of course, they were also, they were fighting each other. And, of course, Osiris was fighting Seth. But usually they kind of go together. It's part of the whole Osiris myth. And, actually, it was Osiris's offspring. No, it was... Well, let's not get too much into the ancient mythology. But anyway, you have Seth and Osiris, because Seth is, of course, part of this whole Osiris myth. And here you have Osiris. And here it all comes together again, doesn't it? Actually, you have the fasces. Here you have the fasces. Of course, this is also a symbol. This was also used in later workers, in socialist workers' organizations. This symbol was used again, the fasces. The skull, also famously, you probably saw that sketch, thingy, with, "Are we the baddies? Why do we have skulls on our caps?" So again, the skull was, of course, reused by certain more national socialist organizations, as was the fascists. But the fascist was actually used by both. It was actually, and a lot of people don't know that, the fascist was used by ordinary socialists as well. So you have the fascist, the skull, and of course here we have the eye, and that's the eye of Osiris, as you can see, right? Here again, the eye. So we have that symbol explained as well, because it represents Osiris. And you can see the hat he's wearing. You see that? The hat he's wearing. This image isn't ideal. Look, the hat. See that hat? The form, the hat. Which, of course, explains this hat. So, all of these are ancient occult symbols. All of these are symbols for deities that represent Saturn. And in a future video, maybe I'll explain a bit more about the symbology and the myths behind that, and that also explains why they would choose these symbols in the first place. I mean, it's obvious now that that the first communists were obviously into ancient occult morphology and ancient paganism, and that their symbols are all symbols for Saturn. But why? Why would they choose that? Now you can see that they did choose that, but what you might not know yet is why they would choose that. And then maybe in a future video I explain the symbolism and the myths behind Saturn as a deity. And then it will become apparent, because there is a connection between communist ideology and the ideology of these ancient Saturn worshippers.